Has an amazing view of the Kotel. The Western Wall is right behind me. Behind the Western Wall, you will see this giant golden dome. That, of course, is the Dome of the Rock. That's the Muslim shrine. It's not really a mosque that they put right on top of the Jewish holiest site, which is what it is. The Temple Mount is behind that wall and occupies that entire plateau. We walked over there a little bit earlier this week, and then we're kicked off for the crime of mumbling prayers, which apparently is not allowed formally in Israel because of the Islamic Waqf. We wanted to avoid all conflict. To talk about the geography for just a second, you can't really see off to my left. That would be Ir David. If you could see off to my left, what you would see is that down the hill is the actual site of the Kingdom of David. So Old Jerusalem, which surrounds us here on my right, is actually a much later invention, historically speaking. Ir David is the stuff that's 3,500 years old, 4,000 years old, depending, going all the way back. That is now being uncovered. It's now being unearthed by archaeologists. Old Jerusalem was built much later. You can see that the Kotel, the Western Wall, which is by many thought to be the holiest site in Judaism. That's not true. The Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism. The Western Wall was actually a retaining wall for the actual platform upon which the temple stood. So it's kind of weird. Like, we're actually praying at the retaining wall, not for the actual temple itself. There was another wall that surrounded the temple. It's sort of like praying at the fence of a parking lot that contains the building that you actually care about, right? That's sort of what the Kotel is. The reason that people consider it supremely holy is because obviously it is also the closest place that Jews have had access to for thousands of years to pray toward the point of sort of the what they call the axis mundi in Greek, the sort of or in Latin, the center of the spiritual universe. But the Western Wall itself, there's nothing that differentiates this particular section of the Western Wall from the stuff that is just off to my left, which is more Western Wall. And then if you continue all the way down for thousands and thousands of feet, it continues to be Western Wall. It's just tons and tons of Western Wall going all the way through. The difference is that the Mamluks actually built buildings all the way up to the Western Wall. So this is all covered by occupied. I don't mean that in the sense of like military occupation. I mean like people who actually occupy apartments living up against the Western Wall and have stores up against the Western Wall. And then, of course, the retaining wall continues all the way around. And all of that is just as ancient as the Western Wall here. So there's no particular reason that the Western Wall is any more holy, theoretically, than the Eastern Wall or than the Northern Wall or than the Southern Wall, except for sort of location and the ability of Jews to pray there. Now, the reason that this is important, I'll get to in just a second. The reason that Jerusalem should remain unified and has to remain in Israeli hands, I'm going to explain in just a second, because historically speaking, bottom line is you see around me a thriving city. This was not a thriving city in 1966. In 1966, this was a closed city. The Jordanians were in charge of it, and Jews could not pray at the Western Wall. All of this was closed to both Jews and largely to Christians as well. And that changed in 1967 during the Six-Day War when Israel was able to take over the old city of Jerusalem. As you can see, when people talk about dividing Jerusalem, they're insane. I mean, they're just crazy. If you look over to my right, there's no place to draw a line here. None, right? You can't divide the old city. It is entirely cohesive. The buildings are stacked on top of each other. This is not suburbia. Okay, there's no big street. There's an 8 Mile in Detroit, right? There's not even a dividing line. It's just a giant, well-populated area that stretches for, miles in a particular radius. So the idea of drawing a line and saying on this side of the line, this will belong to the terrorist Palestinian Authority. On this side of the line, we'll have the Israeli government, which is a free and open democratic government, which allows people of every religion to vote and to sit in it and to visit all the holy sites. This wall, the Kotel, was completely closed to Jews for years. There were, going all the way back to before the establishment of the State of Israel, when this was British Palestine. Whenever you see people, by the way, talk about, this was Palestine before, it was British Palestine before. There was never an independent Muslim state of Palestine in this area. It has never existed. Given the way things are going right now, it never will exist because there's just no negotiation to be had with terrorists. The bottom line is that Jews were largely barred from all of the holy sites. In 1967, Israel begs the Jordanians to stay out of the Six-Day War. The Jordanians refuse. They attack Israel. Israel fights back, and they push the Jordanians entirely out of the area, leading to the very famous statement by a member of the Israeli military, Har Habayit Bi'adenu, that the Temple Mount is in our hands. And this has been Israeli territory ever since, as it always should have been, and as it will remain, because the fact is that there is no dividing line that can be drawn in Jerusalem. Whenever anybody says East Jerusalem is the Palestinian capital, what they're really talking about is towns that are located just outside of Jerusalem. They're not talking about like taking this house right here and saying this is now Palestinian Authority territory. Nobody, right, left, or center in Israel, and the left largely doesn't exist because of this specific issue. Nobody is actually going to buy into the idea of taking razor wire and then dropping it right across the center of the old city of Jerusalem. It's unthinkable. It's unworkable. There was razor wire around the old city of Jerusalem when the Jordanians ran it until 1967. It was a complete disaster area. People were not granted access. Again, if you're a Christian and you want to visit holy sites, you need Israel to be in charge of this area. If you're a Jew, you certainly need Israel to be in charge of this area because Jews have been forbidden to pray at their holy sites for hundreds of years, in many cases, relegated to specific days they could visit the Western Wall. There were riots if Jews would visit these places. Even now, there's still vestiges of this in how Israel controls the Temple Mount, in the sense that Israel still makes itself subject to the whims of the Islamic Waqf. So, as I learned earlier this week when I visited the Temple Mount, if you go up there and you mumble some prayers, there is a chance that you're going to get booted from the Temple Mount for the great sin of praying in Hebrew, right? If I went up there and I prayed in Arabic, then I could walk directly up to the Dome of the Rock. I could just hang out in there all day. I mean, people literally do that. In fact, you can establish a school. There's a school on the northern side of the Temple Mount where children who are Muslim actually learn every day. If you're a Jew and you want to walk up there, you have to be guarded by the Mishtara, by the police. And if you commit the terrible sin of praying up there, then perhaps you will be booted. It depends sort of how the police feel that day. If it starts to get really, really bad up there, but that is more a vestige of sort of Jewish-Muslim relations pre-1967 than it is what exists in Israel currently. So, in other words, there are more restrictions on Jews praying in Jerusalem than there are on Muslims praying in Jerusalem, in Israeli Jerusalem. So that gives you a little bit of the context in which we sit. If you're just looking at the geography, and that's Mount Scopus all the way in the background. This is the Temple Mount behind me. You can see the Dome of the Rock. You can see the Western Wall slightly below me. This is the most contested area on Earth. It is also the area that it is vital remain under Israeli control if you actually wish to see freedom of worship, if you wish to see liberalism, and I just mean freedom and openness, then the idea of handing that over to the terrorist Palestinian Authority, or to Hamas, or to Islamic Jihad, or to any of the myriad parties who are currently vying for Palestinian power is full-scale insanity. So when you hear people on the American or European left say, why doesn't Israel just divide Jerusalem? Think about the idea of taking a terrorist and giving them half your house and not moving out. I mean, that is what you are talking about right here. It is just unworkable in every possible scenario. Even the left in Israel has now acknowledged that the city of Jerusalem is not going to be divided. As I said before, when they talk about dividing Jerusalem, they're really talking about like the very, very outskirts that are largely Arab areas. You know, over to my left, you see some Arab towns. You know, everything in Israel is very, very close together because Israel is not a very large country. But I think it's important to actually see it and be here. And if you can't see it, at least take a look at that picture and imagine the idea of a giant wall, a Berlin Wall going up, you know, maybe a quarter mile to my right here. Great idea. Great. If by great idea, I mean terrible idea. Okay.